Father, we thank you for this day, for this morning, and for your word, and for your spirit. I ask that your spirit would illuminate our paths and that your word would not just challenge us, but comfort us, encourage us, that you are the ageless God, and because you are eternal, your promises never expire. And so I ask that as we look at your word this morning, that we would get insight on how to grow old wisely. In Jesus' name, amen. Yes, we're going to talk about my favorite subject now that I'm 70, getting old. Just a few little introductory comments. The first one is this. It's very common, no matter what your age, to be asked, how old are you? Right? Whether you're young or old. And usually those questions get asked the most, I realized, about the very young and the very old. We usually ask very young people, a 10-year-old, well, how old are you? Maybe they had a birthday party.
No, you ask the little ones, how old are you? 3.
Yes.
Well, they always gotta have a half on there because they want to be older. 7.5. Nobody says 78 and a half.
That's true. I tell everybody my age because I'm thankful to God that we did.
And then on the other end, I've noticed that when people get very old, then they get asked again. And, I had a birthday in February, and one of my kids knew it was my birthday. And so they wished me happy birthday. And they said, well, now how old are you, Dad? And so, yeah, it's a common thing. But here's the question that we really need to ask. Not how old are you, but how well are you aging? Getting old is inevitable. How you age is a choice. Getting old is inevitable, but how you choose to age is totally up to you. It's a choice. And with that said, another thing we've all noticed, that there are what I call typical thought patterns that people have as they progress through life. When you're 5 years old, one of your typical thought patterns in November is, what am I going to get for Christmas? Right? And so then you ask a high schooler what they're thinking about, and especially in the last couple of years, then it's all about college. Am I going to go? Am I not going to go? Then as time passes, am I going to marry this person? Or what am I going to do for a living? I call typical thought patterns, and when I say typical, because they occupy a lot of that person's consciousness at that stage of life. And one of the things I've noticed, I'm sure you have about old people, they have typical thought patterns too. Like, what time is dinner? But there are 3 very typical thought patterns that I've noticed in myself and in others as we age. The first one is guilt. Why do old people carry around a lot of guilt? Well, they've lived long enough to make a lot of mistakes. And they may not have even known the mistakes they were making when they were 40 or 50, but later on, it's very clear to them. Either things they did, they wish they wouldn't have done, or on the other side, I call it missed opportunities. They had an opportunity at a particular season of life. That season passes, you get older, and you realize, I had opportunities I didn't take advantage of. Another thought pattern I've seen about some old people is self-pity. And usually that creeps in with declining health. Health challenges mount, everything gets harder, and they start looking around either at younger people or even people their age that are doing better. And they do this comparison, and that comparison leads to a certain amount of self-pity. They feel sorry for themselves. But the one we're going to look at today, and I think this is one that's most prevalent, is fear. The phrase, what if, creeps into an old person's thought process a lot more than it does a 25-year-old. What if this happens? What if this happens? All these things that might go wrong. And of course, when you're old, the reason that's there is because you've seen a lot of things go wrong. You know what can go wrong. When you're 25, you think you're bulletproof, right? Stock market's only going to go up, right? So this attitude of fear creeps in. And the problem with fear, I've noticed, is the more that it's there, the smaller a person's world becomes. They get afraid to even go out their front door. And it's interesting when you read Ecclesiastes, and he's in chapter 12, last chapter, the writer uses a number of metaphors to describe the old age process, but it also makes some what I call literal declarative statements. And one of them is, what is it? You're afraid of heights and dangers along the road. You're afraid of heights and dangers along the road. What's the writer trying to say there? That one of the things that our perception of risk goes up is just once we leave the house. I might have a car wreck. I know a lot of older people, it's like, Jimmy, I'm afraid to drive at night. I don't drive at night anymore. All of these things creep in. And so we have to ask ourselves, how wise is all of that? And so there's a chapter in Psalms, Psalm 90. We're going to look at it later at the end of this, but I want to just lift out a couple of verses this morning before I go any further. And one of them is a statement we'll all agree with. The psalmist says, 70 years are given to us, some even live to 80. Is that not the average lifespan for the most part? The interesting thing is that was written probably about 1000 BC, before polio vaccinations, before smallpox was eradicated, and all of this. So anyway, and then a couple of verses later, he says this, and this is the verse I really want you to concentrate on. And Moses writes this psalm, and he turns this into a prayer. He says, so teach us to number our days that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. Teach us to number our days so that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. What does he mean by that? He means simply this. When you look at the 70 and 80 year statement, he says this, our time is limited, so this limited resource, help us to spend it wisely. You don't really think about spending money wisely if you have a lot of it. But if your dollars are limited, if that resource is limited, you think a lot about allocating it out and how you're going to spend it. So with that said, let's look at a very famous old man who aged well. His name is Caleb. Turn to Numbers chapter 13. And we're going to read verses 27 through 33. Numbers 13, 27 through 33. What do y'all know about Caleb before we get started? Other than you. Does anybody know anything about Caleb?
I'm trying to remember. I do know about Caleb, but I've got a brain fog.
Anybody remember who Joshua was?
Yes.
Caleb was Joshua's compadre. They both were spies that when they got to the Jordan River to spy out the promised land, you remember Moses sent spies into the promised land? He sent 12 spies, a spy representing each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joshua was one of them, and Caleb was one of them. What do you remember about that episode? They go in and they spy out the land, and they come back. What happens next?
It's terrible. Be careful. Watch out. There's bad stuff over there.
There's bad stuff. Anybody remember anything else?
Yes, they reported that the land was beautiful, it was fertile, and all of that.
Milk and honey.
Yes,
Which one?
milk and honey.
Read with me starting in Numbers 13:27. This was their report to Moses. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and is it indeed a bountiful country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here's the kind of fruit it produces. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let us go at once to take the land. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who had explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. So they go in and they see all of this, and they come back with this report. The first thing that we see here is that the majority saw a set of circumstances this way, and Caleb saw it a different way. What's the difference? Here's the key thing. Caleb never told those people they had the facts wrong. Caleb never contested these people's statement about the facts. The people that saw the giants, the people that saw the problems, Caleb did not say this: you didn't see it right, guys. You're just imagining things. He did not deny the facts.
It's all about your attitude toward things, the way we look at
Why
it.
was he so optimistic?
I don't know.
Did he see himself as a big warrior? Why was he so optimistic when they were so pessimistic?
He had God in his.
Pardon?
He had God.
Can you elaborate on that?
He had God in his word. And he
So
knew
did those
to do all
people.
things with him.
Those people knew the same God he knew.
Well, he believed God and trusted God.
Uh-huh. He trusted God in spite of what he saw,
Right.
but he never denied what he saw.
Correct.
God never asked us to deny literal facts. Never.
Can I talk now?
You can. Go ahead.
His perspective of God was bigger than his problem because he trusted God. So his God was bigger than the giants. His God was bigger than the task at hand.
Let's flip over a page to Numbers 14. And this event continues to unfold. And I'm going to summarize the first few verses of Numbers 14. Basically, now there's this big uproar, and Moses has to figure out what they're going to do, and the people are all hysterical and so forth. But pick up with me in verse 6. Two of the men who had explored the land, Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, tore their clothing. They said to all the people of Israel, "The land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It is a rich land flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them." But the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. And then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tabernacle. And we're going to stop there. But here is the thing I want you to zero in on. Let's look back at verse 9 and look closely at what he said, what Caleb is saying to these people. Don't rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid of the people of the land. If you look at that statement, he's making two phrases equal to each other. He's making two phrases equal to each other. Don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. Do you see that? Do you see how he equates rebellion against God and fear? So I want to ask you this. Is it wrong to feel afraid?
Not really.
Why do you say that?
because we're human and we sometimes forget that, you know, God is really in charge, so we kind of take that away. But when we do that, when we take and put fear back in there, then God really can't come along and, you know, He will protect us, but we're kind of letting Him down, I guess, or something. But He will do that, but we express that, which He understands.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so I don't think that He casts away or anything like that. But I feel that we have the right to tell the Lord, you're in charge of my life,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm afraid.
Right.
And I need to be careful to have the wisdom to listen to you at this moment.
Right. Okay. Okay. Anybody else?
I think Scripture says, "Do not fear." So, if you have the faith and the strength, then that prevents you from getting to that state of fear. You move through it, you give it up to the Lord, and have faith that He's going to resolve the issue that you are concerned about.
Right.
And
Mention- Go ahead.
It's not the absence of fear, it's like you said earlier, it's how you handle it.
Yes, it's how you handle it. I'll never forget seeing these men who were in various wars, watching this TV show, and they were being interviewed. That all had won the Congressional Medal of Honor, highest award you can win for bravery. And the interviewer asked all the same question: "Were you afraid?" And some of them, after letting out a string of profanity, said, "I was scared out of my wits." All these men were afraid when they did the most courageous thing. All of these men were terrified when they acted the most unterrified. I don't know that Caleb did not feel fear, but here is the deal. It's not how you feel, it's how you act in spite of it. If I'm sitting here waiting for God to somehow wave a magic wand and make me unscared, that may never happen. And if I'm looking at that and expecting that, then my expectations need to be re-examined. I'll give you another one in regard to emotions. One you're more familiar with in Ephesians. Be angry, yet do not sin. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. What's more explicit than that? Because when he says be angry, when you look at that in the original language, it's not simply a suggestion, it's actually an imperative. Be angry, but do not sin. It's an imperative statement.
Righteous anger and unrighteous anger.
It's all how you handle it.
That's right.
It's all how you handle it.
Jimmy,
Yeah, go ahead.
Christ had all of those emotions in the garden.
You did.
All of them. Every emotion that we have ever experienced, he did too. And he took them with him to the cross. He still did it.
He still did it.
Anyway.
Mhm.
It wasn't like, okay, when he said, Father, your will be done, didn't mean that they went away.
No,
Those emotions went with him to the cross.
right. They did. So, what we see here, though, is this playing out, but what we need to understand is, did Caleb actually know anything that these people didn't know? Did Caleb have some kind of extra information that these people that didn't want to go into the promised land know? What was the difference in what these people knew? There's no difference at all, right? There's no difference at all. They're all operating with the same information. We can be over there in that building with 400 other people and all be reading the same book, the same Bible. It all comes down to the individual. And here's the thing. Just because they knew these promises, just because Moses had taught those people, that was no guarantee they were actually acting on it. In other words, hearing information is not enough. Hearing information is not the end game.
And seeing the mighty hand of and it still did not penetrate their souls to do what they should do.
No, they had had, in a sense, a great history. In fact, they all went through the Red Sea, right? You would think seeing the Red Sea parted would, sustain my faith a pretty long ways, right? You would think manna falling from the sky day after day would sustain my faith a pretty good ways, right?
They saw the plagues.
They saw the plagues. You would think seeing a bunch of dead people in Egypt when your kids were alive would matter.
And they saw God's cloud going before them.
They saw the cloud in the day and the pillar of fire by night. I don't know about you, but I've never had any visible manifestation of God's presence in my life. I've seen actions like you where I'd say, oh, that's the hand of God, but that's not the presence, a visible presence. These people had all that behind them. And yet, it comes to this. In verse 10, but the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. Let's look at that a little bit. One of the things I've noticed, when I was talking a few minutes ago about getting older and having fear, if I'm going to be different, then I have to make up my mind on how I'm going to see these threats. Or to put it a different way is this. Joshua and Caleb not only had to look at the battles in the promised land and decide they're going to stand on God's promises, what's happening now? They have to stand up to their friends. They could have been having to stand up to even family members. In other words, what I'm saying is this. If I decide to live with courage, part of that courage that I'm going to have is not just about facing some threat out there. It's about facing loved ones who are close to me that may not agree. They may not like my decision. They may not approve of my decision. Hopefully they won't talk about stoning me. But you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
In other words, I'm telling you this. If you choose to be a courageous old person, you will be in the minority. If you choose to live your old age with courage, I can promise you, you will live in the minority. Because like I said in the introductory comments, fear controls a lot of old people's lives. So not only did Joshua and Caleb have to look at the battle that really has to be fought, now they've got a second battlefront right at their front porch opening up, so to speak, with the people that they know, the people they've traveled with. And once again, all of these people have gone through these things together. And now we've come to a polarization or a separating. Which way are you going to go? Turn to Joshua chapter 14. And let's continue the story. What's happening here? I'll tell you what's happened. 40 years have come and gone. In Numbers, where we left off, and all the people decided they didn't want to go and face the battle, I'm sure you remember what happened from there. God said, okay, you don't want to go forward? Go wander around the desert for 40 years. You remember that? So that's what's happened between the passage in Numbers and now this passage in Joshua. 40 years have come and gone. So what's happened in 40 years? Everybody's gotten 40 years older. Right? So now we go from people who were in the prime of their life. Caleb was in the prime of his life. Now 40 years has come and gone. Because he had to wander around just like the rest of the people did.
Yeah, but he and Joshua were the only ones that survived that because
Yeah.
God had everybody that was
They died. Right,
And
right.
older died.
Right. But Joshua had to put up, and Caleb had to get up with what? Getting older.
Right.
Joshua and Caleb, even though through no fault of their own, and here's an important point, they were willing to have courage, but they had to pay the price for the people who had fear. Even though they had courage, they had to pay the same price for the people who didn't. What am I saying? Your virtue, your courage, whatever it is, will not always protect you from the consequences of those who don't have it. So,
No, they might say you have dementia.
yes, very true. So,
Or something else, but I guess.
So, 40 years have come and gone. Verse 6, Numbers 14, verse 6, Joshua 14, verse 6. A delegation from the tribe of Judah, led by Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, came to Joshua at Gilgal. Caleb said to Joshua, remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me when we were at Kadesh Barnea? I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave an honest report, but my brothers who went with me frightened the people from entering the promised land. For my part, I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. So that day Moses solemnly promised me, the land of Canaan on which you were just walking will be your grant of land and that of your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well as he promised for all these 45 years since Moses made this promise. Even while Israel wandered in the wilderness, today I'm 85 years old. I'm as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey, and I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts we found the descendants of Anak living there in great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land just as the Lord said. So Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave Hebron to him as his portion of land. Let's dissect what Caleb is saying here, because what's important now is obvious. This man's 85 years old. And all these years have come and gone. Here's what he's not doing. He is not looking backwards. He is looking forward. He is not looking backwards. He's looking forwards. And not only that, and I realize this is not really explicit in the text, but think about it. He had to pay the penalty as same as those other people did, right? I would think, looking back, I would be angry with those people. I would be angry with them because of what it cost me, what their disobedience cost me. What you don't see him doing is being vindictive and angry about those 45 years that he's lost. He's not looking back and being angry at people in his past. I've known old people that are bearing a grudge from things that happened to them 20 and 30 years ago. And I see a lot of people nodding. Not only can old people be trapped by fear, they can be trapped by revenge.
And bitterness. They get
Bitterness.
bitter.
They look at what somebody cost them instead of looking forward to what God has promised them. I will say that again. Instead of looking forward to what God has promised them about their future, they look backward about what someone took from them in their past. And they're stuck. They just can't seem to get past it. You don't see that with Caleb. This guy's eyeballs are straight ahead. What else do you see? You remember in Psalm, I quoted that verse about some live to 70 and some to 80. Look at verse 10. What does Caleb say? Now, as you can see, the Lord has kept me alive and well, as he promised. Think about that. This man has a rock solid belief in the sovereignty of God. He has a rock solid belief in the sovereignty of God.
Every day he probably got up and said, okay, God, what's next?
Yes. He never said, he didn't look backward and say, God, why did you let that happen to me? He didn't look backward and say, God, why did you let that happen to me? He didn't look backward and say, God, did you pay those people back? No. He just looked forward. He said, God's kept me alive for 45 years. And then he said, since Moses made this promise, even while Israel wandered in the wilderness. So this man looks at the promises of God and he said, it may take 45 years for them to come true, but that's okay with me. Think about that. Think about that. This man has stood on this promise, waiting for it to come true for 45 years. And that waiting time that he had to endure was no fault of his own. That waiting time that he had to endure was no fault of his own. And then he says the obvious. Today I'm 85 years old. Well, I'll let you write in your Bible whatever age you are today under that verse. Because here is the deal, is that what he sees is this. I'm 85, so what? He doesn't say I'm 85, so now I can't do this, and I can't do this, and I can't do this, and I can't do that, and I can't do that. He makes two statements. I'm 85, God's kept me alive, and I have this promise. That's all I really need to know. And he stands on that. And not only that, even as we said this, that even though you have fear, you act like you have courage, right? Because that's what courage is. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the conquering of fear. So Caleb stands here, and here's the deal. He could have said, well, you know, because you got to keep in mind, Canaan is not completely conquered. And we're going to see that in a minute. Caleb says, I still have battles I actually have to fight. In other words, here's what we need to understand. Caleb is not standing here in front of Joshua and saying, now that we've conquered the land, I want my piece of real estate. What he's saying is, here's this. We're here. There's still battles to be fought, okay? And I want your permission to go fight my battle for my hill.
But they also knew what God told them where they were going. I mean, you know, they had that direction that that land was promised to them.
Yes.
And so,
They-
what was the problem?
We have promises that God has made to us. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the problem?
That's right.
That's the deal. So when you read the backstory to this, they've conquered a lot of the places there, but not all of them. And at that point, then each of the tribes were supposed to get their chunk of real estate. And so Joshua knows what real estate, Caleb knows what real estate he's entitled to. So here's what I want you to see. He doesn't step up to Joshua and say, everything's great, now I can build my house. He basically is saying, I'm ready to go fight. In other words, he does not say, everybody's fought the battles, everything is nice, and now I can build my mansion and be comfortable.
He also didn't say, okay, now that I'm 85, I want the plains, not the mountain and the hilly part, where the giants live.
That's an excellent point. Here is the deal. It wasn't his decision to make on what tribe got what land. It wasn't his decision to make on what tribe got what land. He took what, under the sovereignty of God, was handed to him. And he didn't ask for a different battle to fight. He accepted the battle that was in front of him based on how the land was allotted. Skip down to verse 12 and let's read that again. So, give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts, we found the descendants of Anak living there in great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land. Do you see what's going on there? The battle is still yet to be fought. The battle is still yet to be fought. It's not over. And he says this, but if the Lord is with me, I will drive them out of the land. What's implied there?
He can't do it by himself.
That's right.
He can't do it by himself, and I don't know that he's confident that it's going to be a great outcome. Because he said, if the Lord is with me, in other words, what's implied there is, well, what happens if he's not? So on the one hand, I think he had confidence that God was. God made the promise. But here's the deal. When you look at those battles, people died in those battles. People died in those battles.
A lot of times in the Bible, when if is there, a lot of times it means since, because of. So I think that's more of the verbiage of that word there, instead of if, I'm not sure, but more because of
Right.
the Lord
Right.
is on my side. It
Right.
will happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
My Bible says,
Yeah.
but the Lord helping me. It
Right.
doesn't say
Yeah.
that.
And that's the thing. It's ambiguous enough. And I'll say that it's ambiguous enough. You have to look at these nuances. But here's the deal. The big picture is obviously, if he didn't think God was going to deliver, he wouldn't have stood up to those other spies 45 years ago.
Right.
And if he didn't think God was going to deliver, he wouldn't even be asking for this.
That's right.
Right. Especially the hilly part where
Yeah.
the giants were.
Yes. The thing is that, here's the deal. The promises that God made us, well, before I say this, let me ask you this. Anybody in here been a believer more than 50 years? Yeah. A lot of you have been believers more than 50 years. Here's the deal. Those promises that we knew that are in the Bible, that we claimed maybe when we were 30 or 40, when we were full of faith, let me ask you something. Does it take more faith to claim them at 80?
Well,
You're nodding.
Yeah, I do, because sometimes your promises, like I've said before, talking about it, reading about it, thinking about it is not the same as living through it. And even though I know the promise, I know all of that, I believe him, I've seen him work, still, there it is. The reality of
Yep,
it.
the reality of
And
it.
I'm older, I'm weaker, maybe not smarter, I don't know.
Here's what happens. We know, like you say, we're weaker. We know we can make mistakes. All of that kicks in to add up to fear. All of those things that you just talked about support an attitude of fear. So what happens, I think, between the time we're 30 or 40 and 80, we would not say God has changed. We would say, yeah, I still believe the promises, but it's harder to believe them and bank on them. It's not so much that we don't understand them, it's harder to lean on them because we know what can go wrong.
sometimes you think you know, and it's hard to believe sometimes. We know what God is doing for us, we're leaning on him and things, but sometimes it's hard to believe that, at 80, 85, 87, what the next step is in that, so you just have to lean on God.
Let me make a statement. I want y'all to see if you agree with it. Faith is risk.
Is what?
Faith is risk. Faith is risk.
Well, faith is not sitting still.
It's
Faith-
action.
Faith is an action.
It's an action. It's a verb.
It is.
It's a verb.
And you step into faith.
Yes.
And so, yeah, anytime you step forward, it's a risk.
Yes. A commentator I read some time ago, and this was talking about Abraham, and you're all familiar with his life. He made this observation about Abraham. When you dissect Abraham's prayers versus what he did, here's what you see. His prayers were full of doubt, but his actions showed faith. His prayers were full of doubt, but his actions showed faith. And I think that kind of ties in with the idea that faith is risk. Obviously, you can tell God what you feel. The book of Psalms basically is devoted to that when you look at it, right?
Yes.
Obviously, you can tell God how you feel. There is no problem there, okay? But the thing is that faith is risk, and faith ultimately expresses itself in an action, not in a statement. So, Caleb sees the battle. What do you know about the descendants of Anak? Let's have a Bible trivia quiz. Anybody heard of Goliath? Go ahead. I know you want to talk about that.
I haven't got an hour.
Okay. Anyway, when you unravel the biblical history that's there, basically Goliath was a descendant of the descendants of Anak. And so when you dig in a little deeper there, it's like Goliath is not the only giant around. There are these other people, they were extra big. The Bible calls them descendants of Anak. What I'm trying to say here is this, is that Caleb acknowledges these giants were there. And then he says this, they were living in great walled towns. So we have giants living in great walled towns. What's Caleb telling us? Caleb's telling us, I fully realize how big the battle is. You remember I said a few minutes ago, God never asked you to deny the facts? Caleb is not seeing this through what I call rose-colored glasses. There are giants there, and while the phrase great walled towns may not mean anything to us, what is the most famous walled town in all the Bible? Jericho, right? That's just the way they did things back then, right? You didn't have a national military. Every town had to stand on its own security. And so you would build these big walls around towns. And just to give you an idea how big some of these walls were, there were some of them that these archaeologists that have dug up, that they said you could have 3 chariots side by side on the top of them. Think about that. Big walls, not just the brick walls of a house.
You can see the wall of China from space.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
They're thick.
they're
not
thick. That's
just
what,
tall.
yeah, they're
thick.
thick. So Caleb fully realizes the magnitude of the battle that's ahead of him. Now turn with me to Psalm 90.
Yeah. I think it's everything.
Psalm 90.
I would do.
Follow along with me. Lord, through all the generations you've been our home. Before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from beginning to end, you're God. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. For you, 1,000 years are as a passing day, as brief as a few night hours. You sweep people away like dreams that disappear. They are like grass that springs up in the morning. In the morning it blooms and flourishes, but by evening it is dry and withered. Let's stop there. What's he saying here? It comes down to basically 2 ideas. God is ageless, and we are very short-lived. But God is ageless. Skip down with me to verse 10. 70 years are given to us. Some even live to 80. Here's what...
If we have the strength, it says.
Yes, if we have the strength. Yes. Yes. So we have this God that was around before the universe was created in the first couple of verses. And now we have humans that are personified by being a weed that sprouts in your yard in the morning and it's withered in the afternoon. And that's the contrast. You remember what I said about time being a resource that you have to allocate carefully? If you really see your life through God's eyes, that's what it comes down to. But we don't see our life through God's eyes. Here's what happens. When we're 40, you know what we think we got? Forever.
Yes.
Right? Forever. You think you got all the time you need. But we know at this age, nothing really is further from the truth. We all come to the end. We all come to our 70. We all come to our 80. And it's gone. So he says in verse 12, so teach us to realize the brevity of life, or some translations might say, teach us to number our days, so that we may grow in wisdom. Well, let's connect these ideas with what he's saying. Here's what he is saying. If you really realize how short your life is, you will live it wisely. If you don't realize how short your life is, you will live it foolishly. How does that work? I've noticed something. Sometimes there'll be hard decisions in front of me, and you know what I want to do? Procrastinate.
Yeah.
I'll put that off. I'll worry about that later. Because it's a hard decision. There may be big risk associated with it, big cost. But what's he saying here in verse 12? He says this. He doesn't say, teach us to number our years. Right? He says, teach us to number our days.
Yeah.
Why did he say years? Because he just said you have 70 or 80 years. Why does he say, teach us to number our days? Do you know why? Because today is all you ever really have.
That's it.
You are not guaranteed next year. You're not guaranteed next week. You're not guaranteed next month.
1 minute.
All you have is today.
That's right.
The problem is, if you see your life by years, you'll put those hard decisions off. If you see your life by days, then you'll make those hard decisions now. What made Caleb so different from those others was when he said, the Lord has kept me alive all this time.
And it's amazing how long he does it.
Yes. So Caleb looked at his life through the lens of the sovereignty of God. And because of that, he was a man of courage. Because he knew ultimately it wasn't those descendants of Anak that was going to determine how long he lived. He knew it wasn't up to the doctor. He knew it was just up to the Lord.
And in one of the questions in social studies on the GED asks, why did George Washington read the Declaration of Independence and so forth to his men? Well, I'm not a soldier, but what I've seen, there's a greater purpose. And those people who went into battle, they knew, I'm going to maybe be slaughtered, but there was a greater purpose. And in this case, his greater purpose is God's will.
Right.
But for some, it's just that there's a greater purpose. I'm fighting for this particular thing, you know.
That brings up a good point. Just as a side note, I've noticed that old people that live only for recreation and convenience lose their purpose.
Yes.
Well, there's more to it than that.
Yes.
Some do a lot more, I thought. Pam, you'd have to ask Pam.
Yes. But, I know for me, working for Exxon all my life and then seeing men retire, and they waited for that magic day,
Yes.
They circled it on the calendar 20 years back. And then you talk to them 3 years in, and they're really not that happy. They spend all their days just kind of watching TV, and
Yes.
that's about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Terry said that when he was working in this one company, he said these guys would talk about what they were going to do, and this and that, and he said, and not too long after they retired, they died.
Yeah.
And he was always so struck by that.
Right. There's this one guy, his last name was Nash. And he got up to retirement age, but in his working life, and keep an eye on a lot of us, we saw each other 40 hours a week every day, so we got to know each other pretty good. The nickname for him was Gun and Ash. And why he got that nickname Gun and Ash, because he would always talk about on Friday, well, I think I'm going to go fishing this weekend. Well, Monday would roll around, how did you go fishing? No, didn't go fishing. And he would do that like over a period of years. And so he got the nickname Gun and Ash.
It's funny.
That's the deal with Caleb. The man made the decision today. But keep in mind, here's the deal about habits. We acquire them usually slowly, and we acquire them so slowly we don't even know we're acquiring it. And then we get stuck in this rut of thinking a certain way.
Yes.
And the thing I've noticed about ruts, when you stay in them long enough, they're handcuffs. You're there. Why do I say that? Is that this courage that this man had at 85, it wasn't a new thing. He had it back when he was in his 40s. In other words, you could say he had a lifetime of courageous faith. And I think that's what made him such an example, at least to me, of how to age wisely. I cannot control the stock market. I cannot control Social Security. And those two things have been in the news a lot lately, haven't they? I cannot control what goes on in this church. I can't even control what she does.
She wanted to.
Yes.
I'm not touching it.
Don't even answer.
Just 3 pointers.
And so, this person here who's 70 or maybe 80, I'm 70, I don't know if I'm gonna make it to 80. And you don't either. All you have is today. All you really have is today.
And are we gonna look for the flat land, or are we gonna climb that mountain?
Are you going to take what God has sovereignly chose to hand you and deal with it? Are you going to take what God has sovereignly put in front of you and choose to face it courageously? Caleb did not question whether he got the hills or the plains. He did not spend his time being angry about his past and the people who ruined his past. He stood on the promises of God, and he said, since God has kept me alive, this must be the battle I'm supposed to fight. Since God has kept me alive, this must be the battle I'm supposed to fight. Any questions or comments?
I always wake up in the morning and I give my day and everything to the Lord, but I always look and say, okay, what's next?
Mm-hmm.
I do that every day.
I don't, like I've said many times, I think we say we want to know what's next, but in fact,
Do we really?
do we really?
Do we really?
Because, you know, there's just human nature. Well, we want, but in fact, it's, to me, you know,
Even if you know it, that doesn't mean you can control it.
that's right. That is correct. And then I might not like what he says is going to happen, so there
Right,
it is.
right.
You know.
A courageous man. Anybody else? I'll pray and we'll be going. Father, I ask as each of us wrestle with what you have sovereignly put in front of us to fight, I just ask simply this, that you would help us to be willing to stand on your promise.